What happens when the betrayer becomes the betrayed? When the man who broke his vows is shattered by the same betrayal he inflicted on another. In the quiet shadows of a small southern town, Sheriff Deshaun Calloway, a man sworn to protect and serve, found himself caught in a web of lies, lust, and vengeance, one that he had spun with his own hands. But here's the question, does a man who cheats on his wife have any right to feel betrayed when she does the same? Can anger and outrage be justified when his own actions were the first to break their bond? Or is it pure ego, a bruised pride that couldn't handle losing control over the world he thought he owned? This isn't just a story about infidelity, it's a story about power, revenge, and the dark corners of human emotion. Rennell Calloway didn't confront her husband when she discovered his affair. Instead, she orchestrated one of her own, with his mistress. She didn't shed tears, she waged war. And when Deshaun stumbled into his own home to discover the two women tangled in his marital bed, the explosive aftermath led to a tragedy that would leave lives shattered and a community reeling. So, where does the blame lie? Is it with the man who first crossed the line, the woman who sought revenge, or the mistress who unwittingly became the pawn in their deadly game? This tale forces us to question morality, justice, and whether betrayal justifies more betrayal, or if all it ever leads to is destruction. Now, let's peel back the layers of this tragedy and uncover the chilling reality of what unfolded behind closed doors. The choices made, the rage unleashed, and the irreversible consequences that changed everything. But as we dive in, ask yourself, in this tangled web of lies and vengeance, who truly holds the moral high ground? Or does anyone at all? Deshaun Calloway wasn't just any sheriff, he was the sheriff. A man who, from the outside, seemed to embody everything a leader should be. Disciplined, authoritative, and deeply committed to his community. Born and raised in a small southern town, Deshaun's path to authority was anything but easy. His early years were marked by struggle, a childhood spent in a home where every penny was stretched thin. He was the youngest of three, the one everyone said had the most potential, but also the most to prove. As a boy, Deshaun learned resilience the hard way. His father, a factory worker, often reminded him that the world was no place for excuses. "You make your mark by doing what's right, not what's easy," he would say. Those words echoed in Deshaun's mind as he grew older, guiding him through the challenges of becoming a first-generation college graduate. While his peers sought comfort in staying local, Deshaun aimed higher. He put himself through school, often working double shifts at a local diner, and graduated with honors in criminal justice. His career in law enforcement began with small steps, a deputy fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself in a town that didn't always welcome change. But Deshaun's persistence paid off. Over time, his hard work earned him respect, not just from his colleagues but from the townsfolk who came to see him as a symbol of fairness and accountability. He rose through the ranks, becoming sheriff at an age that surprised even his fiercest supporters. To the world, Deshaun had it all, a thriving career, a home in one of the town's nicest neighborhoods, and a marriage that seemed unshakable. But success comes with its own pressures, and for Deshaun, the cracks began to show. Long hours at the precinct meant missed dinners and forgotten anniversaries. The man who once seemed invincible was now grappling with the weight of expectations he could no longer meet. And in those cracks, vulnerability took root, a vulnerability that would soon invite chaos into his life. Rennell Calloway was a woman who commanded attention without demanding it. Where Deshaun's presence was stern and commanding, Rennell's was warm and inviting. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room with her smile, a community advocate who worked tirelessly to uplift others. Whether it was organizing food drives or mentoring local youth, Rennell had a way of making people feel seen and valued. Her relationship with Deshaun had been the stuff of fairy tales, at least in the beginning. They met during his early days as a deputy, a chance encounter at a community event where Deshaun was volunteering. Rennell, who had been handing out pamphlets for her nonprofit, noticed the young deputy standing off to the side, looking slightly out of place. She walked over, introduced herself, and within minutes, they were laughing like old friends. Their courtship was quick but genuine, built on shared values and a mutual drive to make their town a better place. But as Deshawn's career soared, their marriage faced challenges neither of them anticipated. Renelle found herself alone more often than not, her evenings spent waiting for a man who was always just a few minutes away, but rarely made it home on time. She loved him deeply, but there were moments when she questioned if he loved his job more. Their conversations grew shorter, their silences longer. Renelle, ever the optimist, tried to bridge the gap, cooking his favorite meals, leaving notes in his briefcase, but the distance between them only seemed to grow. She began to wonder if this was simply the cost of loving a man like Deshawn, a man whose sense of duty often left little room for anything else. And in that void, Renelle's dissatisfaction lingered, unspoken but palpable. Khalees Monroe was a name that carried weight in its own right. To some, she was an enigma, to others, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. Her past was a patchwork of struggle and survival, a childhood marked by instability, bouncing between relatives after her mother's untimely death. By the time she reached adulthood, Khalees had learned the art of self-preservation. She wasn't just charming, she was magnetic, the kind of person who could draw you in without even trying. Khalees' entrance into Deshawn's life wasn't immediate, nor was it entirely accidental. They met during a town fundraiser where she was working as an event coordinator. Dressed impeccably in a crimson dress, Khalees carried herself with a confidence that turned heads. She introduced herself to Deshawn with a firm handshake and a playful smile, her words laced with just enough intrigue to leave an impression. It wasn't long before their paths began to cross more frequently. At first, their interactions were professional, short exchanges at community events, polite conversations about town projects. But there was an undeniable spark, a connection that both noticed but neither acknowledged. For Khalees, it was an opportunity. She saw in Deshawn not just a man of power but one who seemed untouchable, someone who could provide the stability she'd always craved. Her motivations weren't entirely clear, even to herself. Was she drawn to Deshawn out of genuine affection, or was it the allure of his authority? Perhaps it was both. What was clear, however, was that Khalees knew how to navigate the complexities of relationships. She was careful, calculated even, in the way she inserted herself into Deshawn's world. And slowly but surely, she began to fill the spaces Renelle no longer could. Khalees' interactions with Renelle were cordial, almost friendly. She complimented Renelle's work, offered to help with events, and even attended a few of the Callaway's community gatherings. But beneath the surface, Khalees' intentions were far less innocent. Her growing relationship with Deshawn was a secret, one she guarded fiercely, knowing the risks but willing to take them. In these three lives, Deshawn's pursuit of justice, Renelle's quiet struggle for connection, and Khalees' calculated ambition, lay the seeds of a tragedy that would shatter their worlds. Each carried their own flaws, their own desires, and their own secrets. And as their stories intertwined, the consequences would become unavoidable. This was no simple tale of betrayal, it was the collision of three lives, each searching for something they could not find in themselves. It started with the smallest of changes, shifts so subtle that they barely registered at first. Deshawn Callaway, a man whose every movement had been meticulously predictable for years, suddenly became harder to read. His phone, once casually left on the counter or nightstand, now seemed glued to his pocket. Calls were answered in hushed tones, his voice dropping just enough to make Renelle's ears perk up. "It's work," he'd say, his eyes darting away from hers. But the frequency of those calls, the way he lingered on them, suggested something else entirely. Then there were the absences. Deshawn had always worked long hours, but recently, the late nights seemed to stretch even longer. Another meeting, he'd explain, or a last-minute call-out. Renelle, ever the supportive wife, nodded and smiled, telling herself that this was the price of being married to a man so dedicated to his job. Yet, deep down, something didn't sit right. A misplaced tie here, an unexplained expense there, small anomalies that, when pieced together, began to form a picture she wasn't ready to confront. And then came the texts. Cryptic messages that flashed across his phone screen late at night, their tone unmistakably casual yet charged. Renelle caught glimpses of them, half-formed sentences, initials instead of full names. One in particular stood out, "Miss you already." When she asked about it, Deshawn shrugged it off, claiming it was a coworker joking about a meeting. But Renelle wasn't convinced. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they began to grow. For weeks, she watched, silently collecting clues. She noted the moments when his stories didn't quite add up, the nights when he came home smelling faintly of a perfume she didn't wear. Renelle was no fool, and though her heart ached with the weight of her suspicions, she knew she couldn't accuse him without proof. So she waited, biding her time, her resolve hardening with each passing day. Renelle wasn't the type to make a scene. She had always prided herself on her composure, her ability to think clearly even in the face of adversity. But this betrayal, this gnawing feeling in her chest, tested her like nothing else ever had. She began to dig, searching for answers in the spaces Deshawn thought were safe. She checked his pockets, his emails, even the GPS history on his phone. Each discovery brought her closer to the truth, but it wasn't until she found the receipt for a hotel room, booked under a pseudonym she recognized from one of those texts, that her suspicions were confirmed. The realization hit her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. Her husband, the man she had built her life with, was having an affair. And not just with anyone, but with Khalees Monroe, the woman who had so easily wormed her way into their lives. Renelle's first instinct was to confront him, to demand an explanation. But as she stood in their shared kitchen, clutching the incriminating receipt, a new thought took hold. Why confront him when she could make him feel the same devastation she now carried? Renelle made a promise to herself that night: she wouldn't act in anger, wouldn't lash out without a plan. Instead, she would pay him back in a way that would leave a mark, one he wouldn't soon forget. It wasn't about revenge for its own sake, it was about justice. And Renelle, in her quiet determination, knew exactly how to deliver it. Deshawn wasn't blind to Renelle's growing distance. He noticed the way her smiles no longer reached her eyes, the moments when her touch felt more like an obligation than an expression of love. And though he tried to convince himself that he could keep his two worlds separate, the lines were beginning to blur. Every time he saw Khalees, the guilt gnawed at him, an ever-present reminder of what he stood to lose. His paranoia grew with each passing day. He started double-checking his phone, deleting messages the moment they were sent. He avoided eye contact with Renelle, afraid that she could see the truth in his eyes. At work, his colleagues began to notice his distracted demeanor, his uncharacteristic mistakes. Deshawn told himself that he could end things with Khalees whenever he wanted, that he still had control. But deep down, he knew the truth: he was spiraling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Renelle Calloway's discovery of her husband's affair didn't lead to tears or a dramatic confrontation, at least, not immediately. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even confront Deshawn when she found the receipt for the hotel room. Instead, she made a decision. If Deshawn thought he could humiliate her, she would show him the depths of betrayal. She wouldn't just hurt him, she would devastate him in a way he could never recover from. Khalees Monroe, Deshawn's mistress, was the perfect target for her plan. Renelle didn't approach her with anger or accusations. Instead, she played the long game. She reached out under the guise of friendship, using her charm and warmth to disarm Khalees. They started meeting for coffee, sharing stories about life and relationships. Khalees, unaware of Renelle's intentions, was drawn to her like so many others had been before. Renelle began planting seeds of intimacy slowly, carefully. A touch on the arm here, a lingering gaze there. Khalees, perhaps emboldened by her affair with Deshawn or simply intrigued by Renelle's confidence, didn't question the shift in their dynamic. She leaned into it, not realizing she was stepping into a trap. Their affair began in secret, with Renelle always in control. She played the role of the attentive lover, drawing Khalees in deeper while keeping her true motivations hidden. For Renelle, this wasn't about love or desire, it was about revenge. Each kiss, each embrace was another strike against Deshaun, another piece of the foundation she was determined to shatter. Renelle had been meticulous in her planning, but she wanted Deshaun to find out. She needed him to see the depths of his betrayal mirrored back at him. So, she arranged for him to come home early on that fateful day. She made sure the house was quiet, the atmosphere charged with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Deshaun arrived home earlier than expected, stepping into the silence with a sense of unease. He called out for Renelle, but the only response was the faint sound of laughter drifting from upstairs. Confused, he climbed the stairs, his heart pounding as he approached their bedroom. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. There, in the bed he shared with Renelle, were the two women he thought he knew. Renelle and Khalees, tangled together in a moment of intimacy, turned to face him. Renelle's expression was calm, almost smug, as she sat up and adjusted the sheets. "I see you're home early," she said, her tone laced with cold satisfaction. Deshaun's eyes darted between the two women, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This?" Renelle said, her gaze locked on his. "This is what betrayal looks like, Deshaun. You should recognize it, it's been living in our home for months." Khalees, now understanding the full scope of Renelle's plan, froze. "Wait, you knew?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "Knew?" Renelle laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "I orchestrated this. Did you really think you were in control? That you could sneak around behind my back without consequences?" Deshaun's fury erupted, his voice rising as he lashed out. "You used her. You used my mistake to humiliate me." Renelle stood, her confidence unshaken. "Humiliate you? No, Deshaun. I wanted you to feel what it's like to be betrayed by the people you trust. To be stripped of your control, your dignity." Deshaun's voice broke with disbelief and anger. "So, you're bisexual now? You sleep with women, too?" Renelle tilted her head, a sly smile creeping onto her face. "No, you made me this way. You turned me this way. Your lies, your betrayal, it all pushed me here." Khalees' voice cracked, her panic rising. "Renelle, I didn't know," Renelle cut her off. "No, you didn't. But you were the perfect pawn. The perfect way to show him just how low he's dragged me." Deshaun's anger boiled over, his hands trembling as he clenched his fists. His world had crumbled in an instant, and the betrayal was too much for him to bear. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he advanced toward Renelle. "You think this is justice?" he roared. "You think this makes you better than me?" Renelle didn't flinch. "I didn't destroy us, Deshaun. You did. This," she gestured to Khalees, "this was just the aftermath." Before either woman could react, Deshaun lunged. The first blow landed on Khalees, who tried to shield herself but was no match for his strength. The room erupted into chaos as she screamed, struggling to break free. Renelle shouted, grabbing Deshaun's arm in an attempt to pull him away, but his rage was unstoppable. The violence escalated quickly. Deshaun grabbed a heavy object from the nightstand, a lamp, its base solid and cold in his hands, and brought it down with devastating force. Khalees crumpled to the floor, her body limp, her final breath escaping in a shuddering gasp. Renelle backed away, her hands raised in a futile attempt to reason with him. "Deshaun, stop. Please," she cried, her voice breaking. But the man standing before her was no longer the one she had married. He was consumed, unrecognizable in his fury. "You destroyed me," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "You both did." He turned to Renelle, and before she could react, he struck again. The room fell silent, the weight of what had just occurred hanging heavy in the air. Renel lay motionless beside Khalees, the two women who had upended his life now lifeless at his feet. Deshaun stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving as the reality of his actions began to sink in. The rage that had driven him moments ago ebbed, replaced by a chilling sense of emptiness. He stared down at his hands, now stained with blood, as if they belonged to someone else. "What have I done?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The room, once filled with the echoes of shouting and struggle, was now oppressively quiet. He looked at Renel's lifeless form, her face still bearing traces of the determination that had defined her. Khalees lay beside her, a stark reminder of the chaos he had allowed into their lives. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, threatening to crush him entirely. The silence in the Calloway home was shattered by the sound of heavy, hurried footsteps. The neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Lorraine, had heard the commotion from her porch just moments earlier. A series of muffled screams followed by deafening silence had made her uneasy. When the quiet stretched too long, she hesitated only briefly before picking up her phone and dialing 911. "Something's wrong next door," she told the dispatcher. "The sheriff's house. I don't know what, but you need to send someone, now." As the sirens wailed in the distance, Deshaun stood frozen in the chaos of his bedroom. Renel and Khalees' bodies lay lifeless, a harrowing testament to his blind fury. The blood on his hands and the mess around him painted a picture he couldn't escape. He had only minutes before his colleagues arrived, but the instinct to act, to cover his tracks, kicked in. Deshaun's years in law enforcement had trained him to think quickly under pressure. Even in the haze of guilt and disbelief, he began to calculate. He reached for the sheet, yanking them off the bed to cover the bodies. His mind raced as he tried to create a plausible story. He scrubbed at the bloodstains on his hands and the floor, knowing full well that time was against him. He grabbed a towel, wiping down surfaces Khalees and Renel might have touched, hoping to erase any trace of their involvement. In his desperation, he staged the room to look like a robbery gone wrong, items strewn across the floor, drawers pulled open. But it wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. Every move he made only deepened the realization that there was no escaping this. The smell of blood lingered in the air, the sheets did little to conceal the evidence, and his hands still trembled with the memory of his violent outburst. When the police arrived, he met them at the door, his face pale and his words stumbling. "There's been an incident," he managed to say, trying to steady his voice. I came home and found them like this." The officers, his own colleagues, hesitated as they stepped inside. The scene that greeted them told a different story than the one Deshaun was trying to sell. The hastily staged break-in was amateur at best, the blood splatter inconsistent with his claims. And Deshaun himself, sweating, shaking, still stained with evidence, was an image of guilt they couldn't ignore. The news of the crime spread like wildfire, engulfing the small southern town in shock and disbelief. Deshaun Calloway wasn't just any sheriff, he was a symbol of integrity and order. For years, he had been the man people turned to in times of crisis. To hear that he had not only committed murder but had done so in such a brutal and personal manner was a betrayal that cut deep. The community that once praised him now struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster painted in the headlines. People whispered in grocery store aisles and at church pews, their voices heavy with confusion and anger. How could he? Some asked, while others speculated about what might have pushed him to the edge. Miss Lorraine, the neighbor who had made the call, found herself caught in the crossfire of rumors and judgment. "I just knew something wasn't right," she told reporters, her voice trembling. "But I never imagined it would be this." Parents who had once encouraged their children to look up to Deshaun now struggled to explain his actions. The betrayal wasn't just personal for the families of Renel and Khalees, it was a stain on the entire town. The investigation into the murders was swift but thorough. Deshaun's attempt to cover up his crime unraveled under the scrutiny of forensic experts. Blood splatter analysis contradicted his story, pointing to a crime of passion rather than a random break-in. The police found no signs of forced entry, and the fingerprints on the supposed stolen items matched Renel and Khalees, confirming that the robbery had been staged. Witness testimonies added further weight against him. Miss Lorraine's 911 call placed him at the scene during the timeframe of the murders. Colleagues who had noticed his erratic behavior in recent weeks came forward, sharing stories of a man who seemed increasingly unstable. The most damning evidence came from Deshawn himself. His fingerprints were everywhere, on the lamp used as a weapon, on the sheets he had tried to use to cover the bodies, and on the bloodied surfaces he had hastily wiped down. His colleagues, though pained to do so, had no choice but to arrest the man who had once been their leader. The trial was a spectacle, drawing attention far beyond the borders of their small town. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the weight of the tragedy hanging over everyone present. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, painting Deshawn as a man whose carefully constructed life had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. They presented forensic evidence, the staged crime scene, and emotional testimonies from Khalees' family and Renel's close friends. The defense attempted to argue that Deshawn had acted in a moment of emotional duress, that his actions were not premeditated but a tragic loss of control. They called on character witnesses to speak to his years of service and dedication to the community, but the evidence was insurmountable. Renel's family sat stoic in the courtroom, their grief palpable as they listened to the details of her final moments. Khalees' mother openly wept, clutching a photograph of her daughter as the prosecution recounted the brutality of her death. And Deshawn, once so composed and commanding, sat slumped at the defense table, his face a mask of regret and resignation. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. Deshawn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his crimes. As Deshawn was led away in handcuffs, the town that once revered him was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered trust. The Calloway home, once a symbol of success and stability, now stood as a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The story of Deshawn, Renel, and Khalees became a cautionary tale, a stark warning about the devastating consequences of betrayal, anger, and revenge. And though the community would eventually move forward, the scars of that fateful day would remain, etched into the memory of everyone who had once believed in the man who had now become their greatest disappointment. The story left questions lingering. Was Deshawn a victim of circumstances, pushed beyond his limits, or was he always capable of such violence? Did Renel's betrayal justify her plan, or did it merely expose a deeper fracture in their relationship? And where does justice truly lie when so many lives are destroyed? As the story closes, we're reminded of the fragile line between love and destruction. This tragedy compels us to reflect on the choices we make and the paths they take us down. When one partner cheats, does it justify the other doing the same in retaliation? Or does it only deepen the wounds of the relationship? Should Renel's actions be viewed as revenge or self-liberation? Is there ever a right way to respond to betrayal? Does the secrecy of both affairs suggest that none of them truly valued honesty, even in their retaliatory actions? Did Deshawn have any right to react with rage when he himself had broken their marriage vows first? Can someone demand fidelity when they have already discarded it? For more gripping stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Deshawn's shoes? We'll see you next time.